The fastest way to discover who truly respects you is to give them a chance to pretend you don't matter. I didn't understand how true those words were until the night my wife accepted the biggest award of her career. 5 minutes changed everything I believed about marriage, success, and the quiet value of a man's name. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 47 years old, born and raised in Pennsylvania, and for the past decade I've lived a life so ordinary that most people forgot I was even in the room. That was exactly how I wanted it. While other men chased recognition, I found peace in stepping back. I let my wife, Olivia, enjoy the spotlight she had worked so hard to earn. Watching her succeed had always felt like winning together. At least that's what I used to believe. The ballroom inside the Grand Monarch Hotel shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across hundreds of black-tie guests. Soft jazz floated through the air while servers in pressed white jackets carried silver trays filled with champagne flutes and miniature crab cakes. Every polished marble column reflected another smiling executive, another confident handshake, another carefully practiced laugh. It was the annual company gala, the one evening every ambitious employee dreamed about attending. Promotions were whispered about here. Careers quietly began or ended between dessert and coffee. Olivia belonged in that world now. She moved through the crowd wearing an elegant navy evening gown that caught the light every time she turned. Everywhere she walked, people greeted her by name. Vice presidents congratulated her. Directors praised her latest project. Young managers admired her the way college athletes admire professionals. I stood a few steps behind her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water, perfectly comfortable being invisible. That had become our routine over the years. Then someone approached us with a bright smile. "Olivia, congratulations," he said. "And who is this?" She barely hesitated. She smiled politely, rested 2 fingers against my sleeve, and answered with a laugh light enough to sound harmless. "Oh, this is Ethan, just my husband." The conversation continued as though nothing unusual had happened. They laughed politely. Someone immediately changed the subject back to quarterly growth and leadership strategy. Another executive nodded at me with the same expression people reserve for chauffeurs or distant relatives they barely remember meeting. I smiled because smiling was easier than explaining why 4 simple words echoed louder than the orchestra. Just my husband. Not my partner. Not the man who stood beside me through every late night, every failed interview, every promotion she celebrated. Just my husband. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe she hadn't meant anything by it. Maybe I was simply tired. Maybe after 21 years of marriage people stopped noticing the weight carried by ordinary words. Still, something settled quietly inside my chest, colder than the ice floating in my glass. Looking back now, I should have recognized that feeling for what it was. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't anger. It was the sound of a foundation beginning to crack before anyone else in the room realized the building had started to move. I spent years believing that love did not need an audience. It only needed consistency. Every mortgage payment made on time, every airport pickup after another business trip, every quiet dinner waiting on the stove when meetings ran late, every Saturday morning spent fixing things around the house instead of chasing another promotion. Those were the moments I counted. I thought marriages were built that way, one ordinary day at a time. Looking around that ballroom, I realized the corporate world counted something very different. Titles mattered. Corner offices mattered. Who shook your hand mattered. Who remembered your name mattered even more. I had never cared about any of it because I had already lived that life once. 15 years earlier, I had stepped away from boardrooms, shareholder meetings, and quarterly reports after deciding that peace was worth more than applause. Most people assumed I had simply retired early after selling a consulting business. I never corrected them. The truth was simpler than people imagined and far more complicated than they would ever guess. I enjoyed waking up without an alarm. I enjoyed driving my old pickup instead of a luxury sedan. I enjoyed buying coffee from the same neighborhood diner where the waitress knew my order before I sat down. Success had given me freedom, and freedom had taught me that anonymity was a privilege very few successful people ever experienced. Olivia understood that once. When we first married, she used to laugh whenever someone recognized me at conferences. She would squeeze my hand beneath the table and whisper that she preferred having me all to herself instead of sharing me with an endless stream of business conversations. Somewhere along the way, those words quietly disappeared. At first it was small things. She stopped introducing me by my profession. Then she stopped mentioning anything about my background at all. Eventually, I became the safest possible description whenever someone asked who I was. My husband. Then just my husband. Later, when company events became more frequent, I noticed something else. She rarely asked me to stand beside her in photographs. If a photographer waved us together, she smiled politely, took the picture, then drifted back toward executives before the flash had even faded. I convinced myself she was networking. Building relationships. Advancing her career. Good husbands supported their wives, or at least that was the story I kept telling myself. Across the ballroom I watched Olivia speaking confidently with senior leadership. Her posture had changed over the years. She carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who believed every room would eventually revolve around her. I was proud of that confidence because I remembered the young woman who used to rehearse presentations in our living room, terrified of making one mistake. I had applauded every promotion because each one felt deserved. Tonight should have been another celebration. Instead, I found myself standing alone near a marble column, slowly turning my untouched glass between my fingers while conversations drifted past like passing trains. Nobody recognized me, which was perfectly normal. Nobody asked what I thought, which was also normal. But there was something unusual in the air that evening, something impossible to name. Every few minutes I caught members of the board of directors glancing toward the ballroom entrance instead of the stage. Their expressions were not impatient. They were expectant, almost as if they were waiting for someone whose arrival mattered more than the awards themselves. I noticed it because old habits never completely disappear. People reveal far more through what they anticipate than through what they celebrate. At that moment, I had no idea that the next person to walk through those doors would change the direction of the entire evening. The ballroom orchestra eased into another polished jazz standard while servers refreshed glasses that were already half full. Conversations rose and fell like gentle waves, but the attention of the room kept drifting toward the grand entrance. I noticed Richard Hayes checking his watch for the third time in less than 2 minutes. The chief executive officer had spent the evening smiling for photographs and congratulating award winners, yet now even he looked distracted. Melissa Grant from Human Resources walked over and quietly whispered something into his ear. His expression immediately changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I had spent enough years in executive meetings to recognize the look. It was the face people made when someone with real authority was about to arrive. Around me, nobody else seemed to notice. Olivia certainly did not. She was standing beside a group of senior managers laughing at a story one of the regional directors was telling. Every now and then she glanced toward the stage where her award waited beneath a spotlight. She deserved the recognition. Nobody could question the hours she had invested or the results she had delivered. That was never the issue. The problem was not ambition. The problem was what ambition quietly replaced when nobody was paying attention. A young manager wandered over carrying 2 champagne glasses and offered me one. I thanked him and declined. He smiled politely before asking, "So how long have you and Olivia been married?" 21 years, I answered. His eyebrows lifted with genuine surprise. That is incredible. She never talks much about her personal life. I nodded without correcting him. He was not trying to be disrespectful. He simply repeated the version of reality he had been given. Before he could say anything else, someone called his name and he hurried away toward another conversation. I watched him disappear into the crowd and wondered when our marriage had slowly become a footnote in Olivia's story instead of a chapter. My thoughts drifted backward to a rainy evening nearly 15 years earlier. We had been sitting on our back porch with 2 cups of coffee while lightning flashed across the horizon. That was the night I explained why I wanted to leave the business world behind. I told her I had already climbed every mountain I cared to climb. I wanted quiet mornings, family dinners, and weekends that belonged to us instead of shareholders. She smiled, rested her head against my shoulder, and told me she admired that decision because it meant we could finally build a normal life together. I believed every word she said. Looking back now, I realize dreams can expire without either person noticing the exact day they disappeared. The applause inside the ballroom suddenly faded as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the evening's final presentation. Crystal lights reflected across polished tables while hundreds of conversations settled into silence. Olivia straightened her shoulders and gently adjusted the silver bracelet I had given her on our 20th anniversary. She looked confident, composed, exactly like the executive everyone expected to see. I genuinely hoped the rest of the night would allow us to drive home laughing about old memories instead of replaying awkward introductions. Then the large entrance doors slowly opened. A cool draft swept across the ballroom. Every member of the board of directors turned at exactly the same moment. The room did not become louder. It became impossibly quiet, as though hundreds of successful people had instinctively decided that whoever had just arrived deserved complete attention. The man who entered did not need an introduction. He walked without hurry, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carrying himself with the kind of quiet confidence that money alone could never buy. William Brooks had served as chairman of the board for nearly 3 decades. Even people who had never spoken to him knew exactly who he was. Conversations stopped before he reached the center of the ballroom. Richard Hayes immediately stepped forward with an eager smile, extending both hands in greeting. Several board members followed only a step behind, careful not to keep the chairman waiting. William acknowledged each of them with a polite nod, but his eyes never lingered on any face for more than a second. Instead, they continued searching the room with calm purpose, as though he had come looking for someone specific. I recognized that expression because I had seen it many times years ago during board meetings. William never wasted time on formalities when something important remained unfinished. Richard began introducing executives one by one, proudly mentioning divisions, performance numbers, and recent achievements. William listened patiently, offering brief smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Then he asked a simple question. "Has everyone arrived?" Richard looked slightly confused before answering, "As far as I know, yes." William glanced across the ballroom once more. "Not quite." Those 2 words were spoken softly, yet something about them caused several directors to exchange uncertain looks. Nobody seemed to understand who could possibly matter more than the people already standing around him. Meanwhile, Olivia remained focused on the upcoming ceremony. She adjusted the small company pin on her gown and accepted another round of congratulations from colleagues. I watched her from across the room and remembered another gala many years earlier when she had nervously held my hand before giving her very first presentation to senior leadership. Back then she had whispered, "Promise you will stay where I can see you." I smiled at the memory because I had kept that promise for 21 years. I had always been somewhere nearby, even when she stopped looking. A server passed carrying a fresh tray of sparkling water. I replaced my untouched glass with another simply to have something in my hands. There is comfort in ordinary gestures when life begins shifting beneath your feet. The orchestra fell silent as the master of ceremonies announced that the award presentation would begin in just a few minutes. Stage lights brightened. Cameras repositioned themselves near the podium. Every guest turned toward the front of the ballroom except William Brooks. He was still scanning the crowd with patient determination. Suddenly his gaze stopped. From where I stood, nearly 50 feet away near the marble column, I saw recognition settle across his face. Not surprise. Recognition. His expression softened into the warm smile of someone spotting an old friend after many years apart. Without saying another word to Richard or the board members surrounding him, William changed direction. One slow step became another. Then another. Executives instinctively moved aside to clear his path, each assuming he must be heading toward an important investor or honored guest. I noticed Richard glance toward the front tables, clearly expecting the chairman to greet one of the company's major partners. Instead, William continued walking deeper into the ballroom, directly toward the quiet corner where I had spent the evening unnoticed. For the first time that night, I realized everyone else was beginning to notice me too, although none of them yet understood why. William Brooks stopped less than 3 feet in front of me. For a heartbeat, the ballroom seemed to forget how to breathe. Richard Hayes and half the executive team had frozen several yards behind him, their confident smiles replaced by quiet uncertainty. William looked at me the way old friends greet each other after too many years apart. Then he extended his hand. "Ethan," he said warmly, "it has been far too long." I smiled and accepted the handshake. "Good to see you again, William." Around us, conversations disappeared completely. I could feel hundreds of curious eyes shifting between my face and the chairman's. Richard hesitated before stepping closer. "Chairman Brooks," he said carefully, "I did not realize you and Ethan already knew each other." William glanced toward him with genuine surprise. "Knew each other," he repeated with a soft chuckle. "Richard, I have known Ethan longer than almost anyone in this company." Richard forced a polite smile, but confusion spread across his face. Before he could ask another question, the master of ceremonies announced that everyone should begin taking their seats for the awards presentation. William looked toward the stage, then back at me. "Would you mind joining me at the front table?" he asked. The invitation hung in the air like a bell that nobody expected to hear. The front table was reserved for board members, major investors, and senior executives. Spouses did not sit there. Guests certainly did not. For a brief second, I considered politely declining. Quiet had always been easier than attention. But something inside me reminded me that shrinking myself had never actually protected anyone. "Thank you," I answered. "I would be honored." As we began walking together, the crowd naturally opened a path. I noticed people whispering behind raised glasses, trying to remember whether they had overlooked someone important all evening. Some searched my face as though recognition might suddenly appear if they stared long enough. Others looked toward Olivia, hoping her expression would explain everything. It did not. She stood perfectly still beside her table, blinking twice before forcing a careful smile that looked more rehearsed than sincere. When I reached her, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "What is happening?" she asked. There was no anger in her tone. Only confusion. "I am not sure yet," I replied honestly. William simply asked me to join him. She looked past me toward the chairman, then back into my eyes. "You never told me you knew him personally." I held her gaze for a quiet moment. "You never asked." The words were calm. There was no accusation hidden inside them. Yet I watched them settle across her face with unexpected weight. William waited patiently without interrupting. That was another thing I had always respected about him. He understood that silence often revealed more than conversation. As we continued toward the front of the ballroom, Richard hurried ahead and personally pulled out a chair beside his own place setting. "Please," he said with obvious respect, "sit here." I thanked him and took the seat. The polished name card resting in front of the plate did not belong to me. An assistant quietly removed it without saying a word. Across the table, Olivia remained standing beside her colleagues several rows away, staring at a distance that suddenly felt much greater than the few yards separating us. The evening had not yet reached its turning point, but for the first time since we entered the ballroom, everyone seemed to understand that the story they believed about the quiet man in the corner had been incomplete from the very beginning. The lights dimmed until only the stage remained fully illuminated. A giant screen displayed photographs celebrating another successful year while the Master of Ceremonies welcomed everyone to the final award presentation. One by one, names echoed through the ballroom, followed by polite applause and carefully rehearsed acceptance speeches. Yet I noticed something unusual. William Brooks barely glanced at the stage. Instead, he quietly reviewed a small leather folder resting beside his plate, occasionally exchanging a few words with another board member seated across from us. Richard Hayes tried to maintain his usual confidence, but every few minutes his eyes drifted toward William, searching for approval that never seemed to come. Finally, the moment Olivia had been waiting for arrived. Her name appeared across the screen in bright white letters, followed by a montage highlighting her achievements over the past year. The ballroom erupted into applause as she stood gracefully and walked toward the stage. I applauded with everyone else. Pride and disappointment can exist in the same heart. That is one of the hardest lessons marriage ever teaches. Olivia accepted the Crystal Award with practiced confidence. She thanked her team, her mentors, and the leadership that believed in her potential. Her voice remained steady, warm, and polished. Every sentence sounded exactly the way a rising executive should sound. Then she smiled toward the audience. "Tonight reminds me that none of us succeeds alone," she said. "I want to thank everyone who helped me reach this moment." More applause followed. She thanked department managers, longtime co-workers, and even an administrative assistant who had organized countless meetings. I listened quietly, expecting nothing. Recognition had never mattered much to me. Still, there is a strange silence that settles inside a person when years of shared life become invisible. After another round of applause, the Master of Ceremonies stepped back toward the microphone. "Before we conclude," he announced, "Chairman Brooks has requested a few closing remarks." William slowly rose from his chair. The room immediately fell silent. He reached the podium without notes, resting one hand lightly against the polished wood. "Every year," he began, "we celebrate performance, innovation, and leadership. Those things matter. They always will." He paused, allowing his words to settle across the room. But every successful organization is built on something far less visible. Character. Loyalty. The willingness to place long-term values above short-term recognition. Several executives nodded respectfully. Richard smiled again, assuming the speech would soon end. It did not. William looked across the ballroom before speaking once more. "There is someone with us tonight who has spent many years avoiding recognition. In fact, I suspect most of you have no idea who he is." Curious whispers rippled through the audience. William continued. "He never asked for applause. He never requested titles. He never demanded special treatment. Yet without his judgment, this company would not be standing where it is today." Richard's smile slowly disappeared. Board members exchanged uncertain glances. Olivia looked from the stage toward the front table, then toward me, her expression growing more confused with every passing second. William closed the leather folder and looked directly into my eyes. Then, with complete calm, he said into the microphone, "Ethan, would you please join me on stage?" The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Hundreds of faces turned toward me at exactly the same moment. I could hear nothing except the soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet sound of my own chair sliding backward as I slowly stood. Every pair of eyes followed me as I walked toward the stage. The distance could not have been more than 40 feet, yet it felt like I was crossing 15 years of silence with every step. My polished dress shoes echoed softly against the marble floor while the ballroom remained so quiet that even the photographers hesitated before pressing their camera shutters. When I reached the stage, William greeted me with a warm handshake instead of the formal nod most executives expected. Then he turned back toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, I believe introductions should always tell the truth." He opened the leather folder and removed several aged documents protected inside clear sleeves. "Many of you know the company that employs you today as Atlas Strategic Holdings. What fewer people know is that before this organization became what it is now, it existed as a much smaller engineering firm with fewer than 20 employees working inside a rented warehouse." Curious whispers spread across the ballroom. William continued without raising his voice. 15 years ago, when the company expanded, a unique ownership structure was created to protect its long-term mission. The founder deliberately stepped away from public leadership, believing that the organization should outgrow any single personality. Most people assumed he completely disappeared. Richard Hayes shifted uneasily in his seat. Several board members watched William with complete attention, already knowing where the story was heading. Others looked genuinely surprised. William carefully lifted the first document. "This is the original corporate charter." A large image appeared on the projection screen behind us. At the bottom rested a familiar signature. My signature. Another document followed. "This is the founder governance agreement." Then another. "And this is the golden share provision that remains active today." The ballroom became perfectly still. William looked across the audience before speaking the sentence that changed everything. "The golden share grants one individual permanent authority to approve the appointment of every chief executive officer and every chairman who serves this company. That authority has never expired. It has never been transferred. It still belongs to the founder." Richard slowly turned toward me, the color leaving his face as realization settled over him. Olivia remained frozen near the front row, one hand resting lightly against the back of an empty chair as though she needed something solid to steady herself. William closed the folder with deliberate care. "Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to properly introduce the man who built the foundation beneath everything we celebrate tonight. Mr. Ethan Carter." For one suspended heartbeat, nobody moved. Then William began applauding. Every member of the board of directors immediately rose to their feet. Richard stood next, followed by senior executives, department leaders, managers, and finally the entire ballroom. Hundreds of people stood together, their applause filling every corner beneath the crystal chandeliers. I did not bow. I did not wave. I simply stood beside William, humbled by a recognition I had never requested. Across the room, I found Olivia's eyes. They were filled not with anger but with disbelief. She was searching my face as though she had suddenly realized there were entire chapters of my life she had quietly stopped reading years ago. The applause continued, growing stronger with every passing second. Yet the only sound I truly heard was the memory of 4 simple words from earlier that evening. Just my husband. Standing before the entire company, I finally understood that the smallest descriptions often revealed the deepest misunderstandings. The applause gradually softened until only a few lingering claps echoed through the ballroom. William stepped back from the microphone and gave me a small nod that said everything words never could. The room waited. Executives waited. Board members waited. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. They expected a triumphant speech, perhaps a declaration about leadership or a reminder of the company's history. Instead, I looked across the ballroom until my eyes found Olivia. 21 years of marriage flashed through my mind, not as headlines or achievements, but as ordinary moments. Sunday mornings with coffee on the porch. Long drives through the countryside with no destination. The tiny apartment where we celebrated our first anniversary with takeout because we could not afford a nice restaurant. Success had never been the center of those memories. We had been. I stepped closer to the microphone. "Thank you," I said quietly. "But I have never believed that respect should arrive because someone discovers your title." The ballroom remained silent. 15 years ago, I chose to step away because I wanted this company to become stronger than the person who founded it. I wanted leaders to earn trust instead of borrowing it from my name. Looking around tonight, I still believe that was the right decision. I paused before continuing. There is only one thing I regret. My eyes returned to Olivia. She was standing completely still, the crystal award still resting in her hands. Somewhere along the journey, the people closest to me stopped seeing the man and started seeing only the position they thought I no longer had. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. This evening I was introduced with 4 simple words. Just my husband. I smiled gently, not with bitterness but with sadness. There is nothing small about being someone's husband. It is the greatest title I have ever accepted. It deserved more respect than the word just. I saw Olivia lower her eyes. Her shoulders, which had carried so much confidence only minutes earlier, now seemed impossibly heavy. Slowly she walked toward the stage, each step careful and uncertain. When she reached me, she did not look at the audience. She looked only at me. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely louder than the room's quiet air, I am so sorry. There were no dramatic tears. No desperate speeches. Just honest regret written across her face. I believed she meant every word because regret has a look that cannot be rehearsed. I answered softly enough that only those nearest the stage could hear clearly. I never needed you to introduce me as a founder. I took a slow breath. I only hoped you would never be embarrassed to introduce me as your husband. Her eyes closed for a brief moment as those words settled between us. They carried more weight than any corporate document William had displayed. Around us, people looked away, giving us a privacy that was impossible in a room filled with hundreds of guests. William quietly folded the old documents and stepped farther back, allowing the moment to belong to us rather than the company. I realized then that the greatest victories are rarely about proving everyone else wrong. They are about revealing truths that have been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along. Titles may impress strangers, but character is what the people closest to us remember when the applause finally fades. The gala ended with the same music that had welcomed everyone a few hours earlier, but nothing about the room felt the same anymore. Conversations that once revolved around promotions and quarterly profits had shifted toward quieter subjects. People spoke about humility. About respect. About the surprising truth that the quietest person in the room had carried the greatest responsibility all along. I stepped away from the stage while guests slowly returned to their tables. Several executives approached to introduce themselves properly, extending hands they had not thought to offer earlier that evening. They were courteous, sincere, and perhaps a little embarrassed. I greeted each of them with the same calm respect I had offered before anyone knew my history. Titles had not changed who I was, and recognition certainly would not. Richard Hayes eventually made his way through the crowd until he stood in front of me. His confidence had been replaced by thoughtful humility. Mr. Carter, he said, I owe you an apology. I believed I understood this company. Tonight I realized there is still much for me to learn. I smiled gently. Leadership begins the moment we accept that lesson, Richard. He nodded once, thanked me, and quietly returned to the board members. William walked over a few moments later carrying the old leather folder beneath his arm. You handled that exactly the way I hoped you would, he said. People will remember your words far longer than they remember those documents. I laughed softly. The documents built a company. I only wanted to remind everyone what keeps one together. William placed a hand on my shoulder before excusing himself to speak with the board. One by one, the ballroom gradually emptied beneath the fading glow of the chandeliers. Outside, the cool evening air carried the distant sound of traffic across the city. Valets moved between rows of waiting cars while guests disappeared into the night. Olivia found me standing beside the fountain near the hotel entrance. Neither of us spoke immediately. Some conversations deserve silence before they deserve words. Finally she looked at me and said, I spent years trying to earn the respect of people who barely knew me, and somewhere along the way I stopped honoring the man who always stood beside me. I looked at the water flowing quietly through the fountain. Success has a strange way of testing people, I replied. Not because it changes who they are overnight, but because it slowly convinces them to forget what mattered before the applause started. She nodded, wiping away a single quiet tear before meeting my eyes again. I cannot change tonight, she said. But if you will let me, I want to earn back what I took for granted. I stood there for a long moment, realizing forgiveness is not a single decision. It is a road that two people either choose to walk together or leave behind forever. I reached for her hand, not because every wound had disappeared, but because every lasting marriage is measured by what happens after the hardest truth is finally spoken aloud. We walked toward the parking lot side by side, not as a founder and an executive, not as powerful names inside a successful company, but simply as a husband and a wife trying to remember the promises that existed long before business cards, boardrooms, and standing ovations. Looking back now, the greatest lesson from that evening had nothing to do with hidden authority or corporate history. It was this. The world will always admire the title printed beneath your name, but the people who truly love you should never forget the person who stands behind it. In the end, respect is never created by applause. It is revealed in the quiet moments when nobody believes your name is important, yet someone still chooses to speak it with pride.